This video is about interpreting data from Boxplots. We're going to look at two examples where Boxplots are used to display data from different related data sets. So below is our first Boxplot. We've got a random sample of responses by Americans to the question, estimate the population of Canada. But the question was phrased with two different wordings. So with wording one, respondents were asked, knowing that the U.S. population is 320 million, what is the population of Canada in millions, or estimate the population of Canada in millions? And so this first boxplot drawing is the response to wording one. So this is the responses to wording one. And wording two, knowing that the Australian population is 24 million, estimate the population of Canada in millions. And so these are the responses to wording number two. So these are the estimates that were given for Canada's population by Americans asked this question in the two different ways. And so what we want to do is compare those data sets and answer the following questions. So we want to use the boxplot to answer what is the 25th percentile for responses in wording one? Write a sentence explaining what this means in context. Part B, approximately what is the median for the responses in wording two? Part C, approximately what is the maximum response given with wording number one? What is the maximum response with wording number two? And compare these two data sets. What are some conclusions you can draw from comparing the data given by these two box plots? So just a few things about how these box plots are represented. First of all, they're represented vertically as opposed to horizontally in the last video that we did. And box plots can be done either way, but they should always be along the scale. So before, the scale was horizontal and the box plots were horizontal. Now both the box plots and the scale are vertical. Cool. Some other things to notice here are the endpoints. So in the previous video, the box plots we saw had what we call whiskers at the end, showing the minimum and the maximum. Box plots can be represented with those whiskers at the endpoints or those lines at the endpoints, or they can be represented with having just the endpoint of the line with no line segment. And finally, these dots give us outliers. So these are outliers. So those are data values that did occur that were outside of the majority of most of the other data values. So give this a try, pause the video and try thinking about these, and we'll talk about the solutions in just a moment. Okay, let's talk about these solutions. I'm going to just write the responses and talk through any of the sentences that are required, like the context, and then after I'm going to move down to the next part with my fully written responses, just so that everything fits on one screen. What is the 25th percentile for responses with wording number one? Write a sentence saying what this means in context. So here's our wording one, and what's the 25th percentile? Since the scale is going up, this would be our minimum, and this would be our Q1, which is the same thing as the 25th percentile. So the 25th percentile looks like it's about 100 million. We're just looking for a close estimate. If you'd said 90 million or something like that, that's fine as well. We're trying to get our best estimate based on the graph. So I'd say it's about 100 million. And so what does this mean in context? That means that of the people that were given the question of wording one, approximately 25% of them gave an answer or an estimate of 100 million or less for estimating Canada's population, and about 75% of them gave an estimate of 100 million or more for Canada's population. And again, you can see my full written responses in the next screen. Okay, so approximately what was the median of the responses for wording 2? For wording 2, that's over here, and our median, that's the line in the middle of the box, and we can just sort of go over and estimate, and I'd say that's about 25 million. So about 25 million seems to be the median, and no context is asked for, so we don't need to write anything else. Part C, approximately what was the maximum response with wording 1? What was the maximum response with wording 2? So it looks like the maximum response with wording 1, maybe 240 million or something like that. So wording number 1. And for wording number 2, this is no longer the maximum. In this representation, we are also seeing outliers. So this is our actual maximum data value. And our maximum data value, maybe it's 120 million. Compare these two data sets. What are some conclusions you can draw from comparing the data sets, the data given by these two box plots? So clearly, the values given in wording 1 are in general much larger than the estimates given in wording 2. What might you conclude? One conclusion is probably that it appears that a lot of Americans don't have a good sense of what Canada's population is, and so the way that the question was phrased really skewed the answers that people gave. So just having one other data point, in this case, the data point that the U.S. population was at the time 320 million when this was asked, and that the Australian population at the time was 240 million, having that one data point really skewed people's answers. So it may be the case that either these people don't really know anything about Canada, or it could be the case that in general they don't have a really good number sense, or many of them don't have a very good number sense. They don't have a really good, idea of just how many people or an estimate of how many people are in any country. So they might not know how many people are in the U.S. either, theoretically. So in either case, there's sort of a gap of information, and having one data value really fills in that gap. And causes skewed estimates based on that data. In case you're interested, the actual population of Canada currently is 37.6 million. That's from 2019. It is growing. I think the year before it was 36.3 million, so it is a growing population. So the estimates that were given based on the Australian population were much closer than the estimates given based on knowing the U.S. population. So here are my responses written out for each of these questions. If we're asked to write what is being said in context, then more information is needed, whereas in, say, question B, that's not required, so just a numerical answer is all that you need. So feel free to pause on this screen to see what I'd written as my solutions. Okay, let's do another example. This box plot gives the weights of chickens in grams at 2 months of age with different primary feed types. So use that box plot to answer the following questions. Approximately what is the 75th percentile for chickens fed with casein? Write a sentence explaining what this means in context that includes something about the 75%. Approximately what is the median weight for chickens fed with sunflowers? Approximately what is the maximum weight for chickens fed with sunflowers? And how about for chickens fed with horse bean? Among chickens fed with casein, approximately what percentage of them have weights that fall between Q3 and the maximum, the third quartile and the maximum? And among chickens fed with linseed, about what percentage fall between Q1 and Q3? And finally, compare these two data sets. What conclusions can you draw from these box plots? Assuming a farmer wants their chickens to weigh more, what feeds would you recommend? So pause and try those out. We'll talk about them together in just a moment. Okay, again, I'll write down the short answers and talk through longer answers on this screen, and on the next screen I'll include my fully written responses. So part A, approximately what is the 75th percentile for chickens fed with casein? And so remember that the 75th percentile, that's the same thing as Q3. So Q3 is here for chickens fed with casein. That's Q3, 75th percentile. And it appears that that's probably about, maybe 375. So about 375 grams would be a good estimate for the 75th percentile. What does that mean? That means that about 75% of chickens fed with casein weighed 375 grams or less, and 25% of them weighed 375 grams or more. Approximately what is the median weight for chickens fed with sunflowers? So sunflowers, again, we'd be bringing that over and doing the best we can to line that up with the axis. And maybe that's about 325 grams for the median. Approximately what is the maximum weight for chickens fed with sunflowers? Well, again, we've got that outlier, so we can see where that lines up. It seems like it might line up around 415. So for sunflowers, it was about 415 grams. And for horse bean, that's here, the maximum is approximately 225. So horse, 225 grams. Among chickens fed with casein, approximately what percentage of them have weights that fall between Q3 and the max? So here's casein, and we can look back at that scale. But in some ways, this is a little bit of a tricky question. Remember that no matter what, no matter how the data is spread out, it's always the case that these quartiles divide the data into sets containing 25% of each of the data values. So the distance between the min and Q1, there's 25% of the data in there. Between Q1 and Q2, there's 25% of the data in there. Between Q2 and Q3, there's 25% of the data in there. And between Q3 and the max, there's 25% of the data in there as well. So no matter how the data is distributed, this is the point of a box plot and what it represents. Between any two of those consecutive values, that contains 25% of the data. So between Q3 and the max, 25% of the data is contained. We don't even really need to look up at the box plots to answer that question. And among chickens fed with linseed, what percentage fall between Q1 and Q3? Well, Q1 and Q3, that's the middle two, so 25% plus 25%, that's 50%. Compare these two data sets, what conclusions can you draw from these box plots? Assuming a farmer wants their chickens to weigh more, what feeds would you recommend? So we see that, for example, chickens fed with horse bean weigh the least, so that's not fattening these chickens up, whereas chickens fed with casein and sunflower both seem to weigh more. So you might recommend that a farmer either uses casein or sunflower, and we see that the median is higher with casein, but the data is more spread out. So the weights are more spread out with casein, whereas for sunflowers, nearly all of the chickens have a fairly high weight, but the median isn't quite as high. So you could recommend either of those feeds to a farmer. Now you can take a look at my written solutions to those questions that did require more than just a short answer. So take a look at those. Feel free to pause on that screen. And that's it for this video.